I never saw myself as a criminal. Growing up, I was the girl who never got in trouble. Straight A's, honor roll, always doing what was expected of me. But somewhere along the way, things changed. Maybe it was the pressure of climbing the corporate ladder, or maybe it was just greed. But by 2006, I was in over my head, pulling off check fraud and wire fraud, skimming millions from the very bank that had entrusted me with its fortunes. Check fraud is deceptively simple. It's the illegal act of altering, forging, or manipulating checks to wrongfully withdraw funds. For me, it started with small amounts, just adjusting a few numbers on internal checks, rerouting funds to accounts I set up under aliases. No one noticed at first, and the thrill was intoxicating. But once I realized how easy it was, I escalated. Wire fraud is more complex, but just as dangerous. It involves using electronic communications, like emails or online systems, to steal money or assets. But I worked for a Fortune 500 bank, and I knew all the backdoors and loopholes. So I manipulated the bank's wire transfer system, diverting funds into offshore accounts I set up under fake businesses. I thought I was untouchable. But the reality is no scheme lasts forever. In 2006, federal agents showed up at my office. My heart sank. They had everything: paper trails, emails, recorded transactions. I had stolen $3 million, and there was no escaping it. The trial was fast, and I was convicted of check fraud and wire fraud. The judge handed down a 10-year sentence and ordered me to pay full restitution, every penny I'd taken. They seized everything they could: my bank accounts, luxury homes, cars, everything. In a flash, I went from living lavishly to having nothing. Prison was a shock. The cold, barren walls, the shared cells, the strict routines. It was a world I had never imagined myself in. But in a strange way, it became the space where I started to rebuild. Prison is a world unto itself, especially for women. It's not just the isolation, the stripped-down routines, or the constant surveillance. It's the culture, a place where survival becomes an art form, where relationships, even the most twisted ones, become currency. In a place like that, women find ways to use whatever power they have. And one of the most valuable currencies inside is the attention of men on the outside. We called them tricks. A trick is a man on the outside who sends you money, gifts, or takes care of you emotionally while you're locked up. He doesn't necessarily know the full truth about who you are or what you've done. Sometimes he doesn't care. It's all part of the game. Women in prison get creative, hustling men for whatever they can: commissary money, care packages, even just the comfort of knowing someone's thinking about them. In my time inside, I perfected the art of the trick. I found ways to connect with men on the outside, using the internet, letters, and sometimes even phone calls to keep as many of them on the hook as possible. You'd be amazed at how lonely men are, how desperate they are for attention, validation, or just someone to talk to. I played into that, crafting different personas for each man, feeding them exactly what they needed to hear. Dating in prison was like a chess game. I created profiles on different dating sites using friends on the outside to help me maintain my connections. From there, I'd set up accounts on sites like Plenty of Fish, Match, and even Facebook. I knew how to cast a wide net, chatting with as many men as possible at once. I became an expert at juggling conversations, making each man feel like he was the only one. Each of them believed they had a connection with me, a real one. I had 6 steady tricks that kept me going. First up was David, a 48-year-old lawyer. David was the classic lonely workaholic. We met on a dating site where he listed himself as recently divorced and looking for companionship. He loved the way I listened to him, how I made him feel like I truly understood the pressures of his high-powered job. What David loved most about me was that I never demanded much. I didn't ask for too many phone calls or gifts. I just let him talk, and that was enough to keep him coming back, sending money whenever I needed it. Next, there was Michael, a 35-year-old IT specialist. Michael was younger, tech-savvy, and a little naive. We met through Facebook. He'd messaged me after finding my profile through a mutual friend. He was a gamer, kind of shy, but he fell hard when he thought he'd found a woman who understood his quiet, nerdy side. What Michael loved about me was my interest in his hobbies. I researched gaming, learned just enough to talk about it, and he ate it up. He sent me prepaid debit cards regularly, thinking it was helping me with so-called bills that I couldn't pay from inside. Then there was Richard, a 53-year-old real estate developer. Richard was wealthy and used to being in control. We met on Match.com, and he was instantly drawn to what he called my unconventional charm. I played up the mysterious angle with him, telling half-truths about why I was incarcerated, letting him think it was all a misunderstanding. What Richard loved was how different I was from the women in his world. I made him feel special, and in return, he showered me with expensive gifts, designer clothes and jewelry, care of his personal shopper. They were delivered to one of my trusted contacts on the outside, so I would have them when I was released. Up next was Sam, a 42-year-old truck driver. Sam was from a small town, simple and hardworking. We met through an online pen pal site for inmates. What Sam loved about me was that I gave him attention, something his ex-wife had never done, according to him. He sent me money orders for my commissary and bought me snacks and toiletries. Sam was easy to manage, low maintenance, and always willing to help out without too many questions. Then there was Tyler, a 29-year-old bartender. Tyler was a bit of a wild card. He was younger, full of energy, and had an edge to him. We connected through a dating app, and our conversations quickly became flirtatious. Tyler loved the idea that he had a bad girl waiting for him. He sent me money for whatever I needed, and in return, I played into his fantasies. He imagined a future with me once I was out, and I never discouraged that dream. Lastly, there was James, a 60-year-old retired police officer. James was the oldest and, ironically, a former cop. We met through a mutual acquaintance, and he thought he was rescuing me. I let him believe that, telling him I was innocent, that I'd been framed. James loved playing the role of protector, and he sent me large sums of money to help with legal fees, not knowing that I had no intention of using it for that. Managing these men was like a full-time job, but I thrived on the control I had. Each one served a different purpose, whether it was emotional support, financial backing, or just passing the time. They kept my commissary full, sent me luxuries I wouldn't have had otherwise, and in some ways, they made prison life bearable. What they loved about me was what I allowed them to see. Each man got a different version of me, perfectly tailored to his needs. It was all about manipulation, a skill I honed over the years, both in my life before prison and during my time inside. They were my lifelines, and I used them to my advantage every step of the way. Bitcoin wasn't always the powerhouse it is today. Back in 2008, it was something of a mystery to most people. Just a concept written down in a white paper by an anonymous figure known as Satoshi Nakamoto. It was the world's first decentralized digital currency, a peer-to-peer system without the need for intermediaries like banks or governments. By early 2009, right after Bitcoin was launched, the price of a single Bitcoin was essentially worthless, just a few cents. It wasn't until later that people started to recognize its potential, but I knew its potential from the moment I first discovered it. Unfortunately, buying Bitcoin wasn't as easy as it is today. It wasn't being traded on any major platforms like today. Instead, people had to mine it or buy it through complex online exchanges, often requiring technical know-how. But I had heard about it through a friend before I got locked up. The idea of a currency that was untraceable, decentralized, and completely outside of traditional banking systems intrigued me. I knew that if I could get my hands on enough of it, it could be my way out. The challenge was convincing my tricks to buy Bitcoin for me. These men didn't know the first thing about cryptocurrency, and back then, it wasn't easy to get. But I used the same tactics that had worked before: manipulation, charm, and playing into their emotions. Each man was given a different reason why I needed this new, obscure currency. David, the lawyer, was the easiest to convince. He loved the idea of being ahead of the curve, so I sold him on the idea of Bitcoin as a revolutionary investment opportunity. I played up how risky and exclusive it was, how only a few people knew about it, and how getting in early could set him up for life. It was like a game to him. He was intrigued by the legal ambiguity surrounding cryptocurrency at the time. Getting him to buy Bitcoin meant sending him detailed instructions, walking him through the complicated process, and convincing him to transfer small amounts to an address I controlled through a proxy outside. It took time, but once he figured it out, he was hooked. Michael, the IT specialist, was already somewhat familiar with Bitcoin, though he had never bought any before. I appealed to his tech-savvy side, talking about how Bitcoin was the future of money and how it was built on blockchain technology, something he was fascinated by. For Michael, the challenge was getting Bitcoin without using a mainstream service like Coinbase, which didn't exist at the time. He had to go through obscure forums and sketchy websites to find someone willing to sell him some. Even then, there were no secure ways to store Bitcoin online. He had to send it to a wallet I'd created outside of prison, trusting that I had it under control. Richard, the real estate developer, was more difficult. He didn't understand Bitcoin, but he loved the idea of owning something rare and valuable. I made him feel like he was part of something cutting edge, something exclusive. For Richard, buying Bitcoin in 2008 was like buying an expensive, obscure stock. He had to jump through a lot of hoops to get it, finding exchanges that were in their infancy, wiring money to unknown brokers, and hoping he wasn't being scammed. But he loved the thrill of it, the idea that he was making a bold move for his future. Sam, the truck driver, had no idea what Bitcoin was, and I didn't try to explain it to him. Instead, I framed it as something I needed for legal fees and expenses that couldn't be paid with traditional money. He was so devoted to me that he didn't question it. I gave him step-by-step instructions, and even though he had no clue what he was doing, he followed through. For Sam, the biggest challenge was navigating the technical aspects of buying Bitcoin. He didn't understand digital wallets, private keys, or how to store cryptocurrency, so I had to guide him through every step from afar. Tyler, the bartender, was more open to the idea because he was young and loved the idea of anything rebellious. I pitched Bitcoin to him as a kind of underground currency that was outside the system. He loved that idea. For him, buying Bitcoin was an adventure, but it wasn't easy. Like the others, he had to search out sellers through obscure websites, navigate forums full of scammers, and wire money to people he didn't trust. The process was frustrating for him, but his loyalty to me kept him going. James, the retired cop, was a challenge. He was skeptical of anything that wasn't traditional, but I framed Bitcoin as a safe way to move money without attracting attention. He was already sending me large sums for legal fees, so I convinced him that Bitcoin was a secure way to protect the money from being seized. Getting him to buy it was a struggle, and I had to work on him for months. In the end, his sense of duty to protect me overrode his doubts, and he went through the same convoluted process as the others, transferring small amounts to a wallet I had access to through intermediaries. Back then, there weren't many reliable wallets, and I had no access to technology in prison. So, I had to rely on trusted friends and contacts outside to manage the wallets for me. The trick was setting up these wallets with private keys that only I could access once I got out. I had to be meticulous, any mistake, and all the Bitcoin could be lost forever. It was a delicate balancing act, keeping the assets safe while I was locked up and ensuring that no one got suspicious. By 2014, each of my tricks had managed to buy me a small amount of Bitcoin. At the time, it was barely worth anything, just a few $1,000s at most. But I knew it was only a matter of time before the value skyrocketed. It was my insurance policy, my way out, and by the time I left prison, it had made me a multimillionaire. Looking back, it's almost surreal how difficult it was to buy Bitcoin in those early days. People today can just open an app and buy it with a click. But back then, it was a minefield of shady exchanges, unreliable sellers, and complicated storage solutions. My tricks didn't realize it at the time, but they were laying the foundation for my future wealth, one Bitcoin at a time. After serving about 7 years of my 10-year sentence, I was granted early release for good behavior in 2015. Prison had taught me the art of staying under the radar, keeping my head down, avoiding drama, and staying out of trouble. I'd become a model inmate, teaching financial literacy to other women, mentoring and taking every rehabilitation class available. The staff saw me as someone who had genuinely turned her life around, and I knew that presenting myself as reformed was the best way to shorten my time inside. When I walked out of those prison gates in 2015, I was a different person. But I hadn't forgotten about my hidden stash of Bitcoin. By then, the cryptocurrency had skyrocketed. In 2011, the price of one Bitcoin was around $1. By 2015, when I was released, it had shot up to nearly $300. What had started out as a small, obscure investment had turned into a gold mine. Retrieving my Bitcoin wasn't as simple as logging into a bank account. I had meticulously planned this for years. Over the years, I had made sure each of my tricks had sent me the Bitcoin to specific wallets that only I could access. Once I was out, I spent weeks carefully retrieving the funds, making sure I didn't attract too much attention. Bitcoin was still something of a novelty to most people, but it was growing fast. Each trick had contributed a different amount, and I began transferring the Bitcoin to secure, up-to-date wallets as soon as I could. Here's how it broke down. David, the lawyer, had sent me about 50 Bitcoins during my time inside. By 2015, those 50 Bitcoins were worth around $15,000. Michael, the IT specialist, had contributed around 75 Bitcoins. That stash had grown to about $22,500. Richard, the real estate developer, was good for about 100 Bitcoins. By 2015, that meant roughly $30,000. Sam, the truck driver, sent fewer, around 30 Bitcoins, which had turned into $9,000. Tyler, the bartender, sent me about 25 Bitcoins, which now stood at $7,500. James, the retired cop, who was the most hesitant, sent 10 Bitcoins worth around $3,000 by the time I cashed out. In total, I had amassed 290 Bitcoins by the time I left prison. At a value of about $300 per Bitcoin, that totaled approximately $87,000 when I first retrieved them. I was cautious at first. I didn't immediately sell anything off. I watched the market, understanding that Bitcoin was volatile, but I also knew its potential was far from being fully realized. I lived modestly for the first few years, renting a small apartment, keeping my spending in check while I waited for the right moment. In 2017, the market exploded. Bitcoin soared to nearly $20,000 per coin, and my patience paid off in ways I could never have imagined. Those 290 Bitcoins that were once worth $87,000 were suddenly valued at $5.8 million. I sold most of it during the peak, carefully cashing out through various exchanges and spreading my investments into real estate, stocks, and other cryptocurrencies. I knew I couldn't put all my eggs in one basket. I bought properties in cash, started a diversified portfolio, and invested in businesses that I knew could grow. I kept a portion of the Bitcoin for future gains, but the bulk of my wealth was now secured and safe from the volatility of the crypto market. Today, I'm worth close to $6 million. The irony of it all is that prison gave me the time and clarity to plan my next moves. While others thought I was just passing the time behind bars, I was building my future. As for my plans now, I want to live a quiet life away from everyone. I've had my fair share of risks and thrills, and I don't need to chase that anymore. I've invested in legitimate ventures, property, startups, and even some philanthropic work. Part of me knows I'll always have that edge, that part of me that knows how to work the system. But I've also learned that life is more than the next hustle. I've thought about writing a book, sharing my story, maybe even mentoring others, especially women, about financial independence, the dangers of shortcuts, and how to build something real. My amassed wealth gives me the freedom to live on my own terms, something most people never get. And I know one thing for sure, this time, I won't be giving it all away. Prison also taught me resilience. I started teaching other women financial literacy, showing them how to manage money, make better decisions, and even invest. In return, I learned from them. These women had lived lives so different from mine, and yet we were all stuck in the same place. I listened to their stories, their hustles, their survival instincts, and it helped to keep me sane. I walked out of those gates with nothing in my hands, but left behind the nightmare of prison as a millionaire. I know I'll always have that part of my past hanging over me, and sometimes I look over my shoulder, wondering if someone will come for me again. But I've learned, I invest legally now. I still think about the woman I was before, the risk taker, the thrill seeker, the one who thought she could get away with anything. But I know now that it wasn't a life that could last.